I'm looking forward to our conversation with today's guest, Katie Hafner. Katie was on staff at the New York Times for 10 years, where she covered technology. She remains a frequent Times contributor, writing about healthcare as well as obituaries. Katie is a versatile writer with an extraordinary inquisitiveness. That fact is born out of her 6 previous nonfiction books, which cover such diverse topics as the origins of the internet, the tensions of post-war Germany, the reunification of East and West Germany, and the life of Canadian classical pianist Glenn Gould. Katie is also the creator and host of 2 podcasts, Lost Women of Science and Our Mothers, Ourselves. Katie Hafner, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm so happy to be here.
No, thanks for your time. We really appreciate it. So let's start by playing the brief trailer for season 2 of Lost Women in Science. Can we cue that up, please?
Do I know who Klara Dan von Meumann is?
I'm embarrassed to say I've never heard of her.
Did she have something to do with the weather?
I've heard of John von Neumann.
I'm not even sure how to pronounce her name.
Was she related to Newman on Seinfeld?
I'm Katie Hafner, host of Lost Women of Science, where we explore the work and lives of overlooked female scientists.
What Klara von Meumann is doing is helping to define what is possible on this new kind of machine.
She ultimately became a kind of super programmer.
Their stories are often untold, their contributions unacknowledged.
Clary's role was sort of hidden because she had worked on the very secret bomb calculations.
Women got to be programmers and got to make such a huge impact on the history of programming because that job was not seen as being important.
In 1947, it was Klara and her code that helped make nuclear weapons simulations possible.
Programming was this completely new discipline, so really everybody was starting on the ground floor, as it were.
She always said she liked it because she liked puzzles, and this was a kind of puzzle.
I mean, she's like at Los Alamos as someone with absolutely no training in physics or mathematics, talking one-on-one with Nobel Prize winners.
And she was working with a brand new technology deep inside a world forever changed by the atomic bomb.
There's this connection between death and computing that is inextricable.
Join us as we seek to understand the origins of modern computing through one extraordinary woman's story.
She was sort of there at the moment of creation. If you look at this as a sort of cradle in a manger sort of thing, she was holding the cradle.
Season 2 of Lost Women of Science, coming March 31st. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Katie, I came across that in an article I received from Scientific American magazine a couple of months ago, and I do some work for female veterans in STEM and thought this was a fascinating idea. So I reached out, and so again, thanks for coming on. Why did you start the Lost Women of Science podcast? And is this solo effort, or do you have help?
Yeah, no, such a good question. So, and also I just have to say, hearing the trailer like live, it just went up. It really gave me chills because we have such a great production team, and the story itself is so amazing, but we'll get to that later. So Lost Women of Science. So I've been a reporter forever. And I have a friend named Amy Scharf who has been telling me for years about this one woman named Dorothy Anderson, who was the first to isolate and name cystic fibrosis back in 1938. And Amy for years has been saying, oh gosh, someone needs to, because she's been completely forgotten. And Amy's the close friend of the daughter of the mentee of this woman, Dorothy Anderson. And Amy said, somebody needs to tell her story. And then I guess about 2 years ago, I said to her, well, let's do a podcast about Dorothy Anderson. What a great idea. Because I'd been doing Our Mothers, Ourselves, and I love working with audio. And I thought, that Dorothy's story isn't quite a book. Plus, who reads books anymore? So she said, great idea. And then I said, wait a minute. I'm sure that there must be thousands of Dorothy Andersons out there, women who made huge scientific contributions, but for one reason or another, their story has been lost or they've gone uncredited. So I said, let's do an entire podcast series and call it Lost Women of Science. And Amy's like, okay. And little did we know that we were getting on this train that was leaving the station. And we are now, so we've got the Dorothy Anderson season behind us. We are a nonprofit. So we're a 501c3, and we are incorporated as the Lost Women of Science Initiative. So we are more than just the podcast, because we're an educational nonprofit. So our overarching goal is not just to rescue these women from oblivion, but to encourage and inspire girls and young women to pursue careers in STEM.
And since you started that podcast, again, Lost Women of Science, what has been the most interesting or inspiring story? And what is it about that particular story that really speaks to you?
Well, we're only in our second season, so I can choose between two. And they've both been inspiring in their own way. So there's Dorothy Anderson, who went to medical school in the 1920s, and she was one of 4 women who graduated with a medical degree from Johns Hopkins in 1926. And she was shut out of surgery because that's not something women did. And she became a pathologist because that's kind of a behind the scenes. I didn't even know that back then, 100 years ago, patients didn't want female doctors. And now today, my daughter's just getting her MD in a couple months. And
congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I take full credit.
Absolutely. I totally would.
She'd kill me. I hope she's not hearing this. And then it's now more than 50% of medical students across the US are women, which is a great, great triumph. But I have to say that our second season on Klara Dan von Meumann, who was the second wife of the famous mathematician and computer scientist, John von Neumann, Chris, that season has just stolen my heart. It's an amazing story. And it's got everything. It's got romance, multiple marriages, fleeing the Nazis, Los Alamos, the atomic bomb, then the H-bomb, the very birth of modern day electronic computing and computer coding. Plus, we're saving this woman from absolute obscurity. And so I love her story.
So I asked you which one was your favorite. And you said there were only 2 to choose from. This is your second season.
Oh, but I forgot. We have this, thank you for reminding me. We have this growing database of about 200 and counting women who really deserve our attention. So our idea, and I hope that people listening to this, what we want to do also is crowdsource this. So if anyone and I'm saying all of you, everybody out there, and if you know of anyone whose story hasn't been told, who did something great or even pretty great in science, please let us know, or go to lostwomenofscience.org and click on that contact us button.
So is the goal to have 200 seasons if you've got a database of 200?
Yeah, I know. How old will we be by then? But actually, it's interesting because, it's kind of a continuum. There's, it's a 1 to 10 scale. So number 1 would be like women who are so lost. There's no way to tell their story in a season. There's no way to even tell their story in 60 minutes. And then there are the Hedy Lamar's and Rosalind Franklin's and Ada Lovelace's and Marie Curie's. Those are at 10. So our sweet spot is kind of 4, 5, 6 for a season. But then what do you do about the women over here who still deserve attention? So my idea is to do like a 30-minute interstitial, between seasons, a 30-minute quick take on as many as we can. We just
love
need
it.
more money. We need more funding. So,
And what's the website again? Perfect segue right there.
Exactly. Perfect segue. Donate lostwomenofscience.org. We do have funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, as well as Schmidt Futures, Eric and Wendy Schmidt, and as well as the John Templeton Foundation. All of them are wonderful. And that's going to see us through season 4.
That's terrific.
So, yeah.
That's great. So you touched on a few things that Klara was involved in. What were her contributions to science, and what part did her personal relationships play in helping or hindering her career and success?
Wow, that's a great question. So she was, her life was driven by chance. And, that's the sliding doors effect, where, if I hadn't missed the train, that would have happened and my life would have taken this whole other course. I'm sure do you ever step back and think of your life that way? It's like,
unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
Or fortunately.
Yeah, usually fortunately, actually. Usually fortunately.
Fortunately.
Fair point.
I know. So she loved being in love. She came from a very wealthy family in Budapest, fell in love when she was in her teens, married this guy. He was a compulsive gambler, gambled all their money away, not all their money away, but because her dad was very well off, but her dad ended up basically paying for her to just get rid of the guy. And then she marries another guy who's kind of really wonderful and stable, but super boring. And she's very, very, very smart. But back then women didn't go and get PhDs in science. So she basically had a high school education, which is interesting. And then she must have been so charismatic and just radiated life. And she then fell in love with and married John von Neumann, who was almost as famous in his day as Albert Einstein. He was kind of, back then, it's hard to imagine, but he was like a minor celebrity. He was like the Brad Pitt of, science. and she moved to Princeton to be with him while Hitler was just about to invade Poland. She gets out there at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is this kind of place for geniuses. Like Einstein was there. And then by total chance, she ends up learning how to code this brand new computer, this newfangled thing. And after the war, goes to Los Alamos to work on something called Monte Carlo simulations, which is a way of simulating what you can't really play out.
Model, yep.
Model, thank you, in real life. So they were doing fission and then fusion simulate. Then so for the atomic bomb and then for the H bomb, and it's amazing. They have these, they do it with flowcharts and with these mathematical kind of like just all these numbers. And it's, and we got really, really lucky because we found a computer historian who found this stuff in the Library of Congress, preserved it, and hired a handwriting analyst. And he figured out that was Clary's handwriting. So she actually did the computations. So, and the coding.
It's fun watching you talk about it because your eyes just light up. I know people are listening, but for the viewers, I mean, it's just, you just get so excited about talking about her and the work she's done. It's just fantastic. I love it.
I know, just imagine, it's like she didn't even have the tool. They were creating the tools. So I'm trying to think what a modern day equivalent would be where we have to create our own tools. I don't even know.
And we don't have to think about it because she did it for us.
Yeah, I know. In fact, that is the foundation of modern day computing, of actual coding, is what she and others did. I mean, no, that's the other thing about scientific discoveries is that nobody does this stuff in a vacuum, And so one thing we try to do with Lost Women of Science is debunk what we call the great man theory of history, where it's like one, usually man, did something. Science is done collaboratively.
Bringing things back to the show's theme of prevailing through adversity and achieving personal empowerment, what do you think we can apply from her life that can make us more resilient and successful?
That's such a good question. I mean, I guess I think she just managed to plow ahead even when terrible things happened, as did Dorothy Anderson. Dorothy Anderson, so our first season, she was orphaned when she was very young. And so she had no siblings, no aunts and uncles that I could find. So what do you do when you're left with that? You pick up the pieces. So Klara von Meumann had grown up in this unbelievable affluence. And then her father, who was a big industrialist in Hungary, they had to flee the Nazis, and he couldn't go on. So he ended up throwing himself in front of a train right before around Christmas, I think, of 1939. So right after he got to the United States, I think he was the only word I can think of is tired. He had left everything behind. You would think about it, you build this life. He must have been in his 40s or 50s, and he just didn't want to start over. I think that actually happened. I don't know if it was common, but it happened, that people who had to leave a life behind just didn't have it in them to start over. And I'm so kind of admiring of those who do. Think about it. And I'm thinking now about, everybody fleeing Ukraine. Like, what are they? And you look at the photos, like, and what they're taking. I mean, I think about what these families back then, history is repeating itself. What these families back then who had to, at the start of World War II, get out, if they were lucky enough to get out. And what did they take with them? People sewing money into their clothes. That isn't what Klara's family had to do, because they had the privilege to get the documents they needed and to come over. But, it's all relative. So Klara, she loses her precious father. She's in this new place. She feels insecure, but she managed to fashion a life for herself with this husband, this genius husband. And then, just as things are really starting to kind of bubble along, he gets sick and dies. So then what does she do? I'm not going to tell you, because I want everyone to listen to the podcast.
Dramatic pause. Well played. So women scientists, and it's not something limited to just their profession, often encounter something called the Matilda Effect. What is the Matilda Effect, and when did it begin to be recognized for what it is?
So the Matilda Effect is named after a pretty well-known suffragist at the back in the 1800s, actually, who named Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she actually wrote a pamphlet, which is kind of odd, called Woman as Inventor. And fast forward to the 1960s, and a science historian named Margaret Rossiter, who's devoting her life to writing about female scientists, through history, notices this phenomenon where a woman did something and a man takes credit. And she had to give it a name, this phenomenon. And she decided, because she knew about Matilda Gage, she decided to call it the Matilda Effect. So basically, it's where something gets done. One of the most famous examples is Rosalind Franklin, who, along with Watson and Crick, came to this understanding of the structure of DNA. And it was her X-ray crystallography that led to their discovery, but she got completely cut out of it. They got the Nobel Prize. She had already died. So there's this question, since the Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously, so that couldn't have happened, but she truly was not given the credit until people years later decided to right that wrong. But that's a classic Matilda Effect example. And so we found that in season 1, that was the case with Dorothy Anderson, and it pissed us off.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. So we hope we nipped that one in the bud.
To that point, I'm curious to find out how you found the women whose contributions to science were claimed by men, and especially when many occurred so long ago. Can you elaborate on the detective work behind the stories?
Yeah, total
clues in plain sight.
Total detective work, and not in plain sight, many of them. So this one, which we figured out, actually, we're not even the ones who figured it out. It was our guy, this amazing, he's a pediatric pulmonologist at Columbia University. So, I mean, pediatricians who work with very sick kids are already heroes in my book. And his name is Scott Baird, and he became obsessed with Dorothy Anderson. And he then went on to write a biography of her. And he's the one who figured it out by kind of superimposing the timeline of what happened when, with the time that certain papers were published. And he figured out that she had made this link. I don't know how much you know about cystic fibrosis, but there's this link between sweat and salt and cystic fibrosis. And she made that essential link. And so Scott was looking at how this other person came to be associated with that and not Dorothy. And she never, she wasn't a toot her own horn kind of gal. That was not her thing. And so she really liked staying in the background, but it's still not okay in my book. I don't know what you think.
No, of course. I absolutely agree.
Right.
How prevalent is the Matilda Effect today? And what is it going to take to eliminate it, if at all, if we can?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think it's probably much less. I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm going to say, because women are making advances in science, and that it's less prevalent. It's also known to be not okay, and there are more kind of monitors and checks and balances on the whole scientific process than there used to be. So I'm sanguine about how things are going. But I think that as we go forward with Lost Women of Science, we're going to find it more and more, but only if we can document it. We can't speculate. It's not our business to speculate. We're very careful about speculating in this podcast.
Well, you talk about documenting. You've mentioned that for centuries, women have been omitted from the pages of history. Is that simply because there just weren't as many women writers in the past as there are today?
You mean women scientists?
Yes.
I disagree. I don't think so. I mean, I did think so, but now that I have, so I hope I can squeeze this in before the break.
You've got time.
Really briefly, if I can do this. In investigating season 2 about Klara von Meumann, one of my producers and I went to the UCSD archives. It was actually our senior editor, Nora Matheson, and we were sitting in the archives special collections room, and we were looking through the files. You know how archives are organized in big boxes and then file folders. And we were just going along looking at this other person, a man named physicist named Carl Eckart, who was Clary's 4th husband. I know, but who's counting, right? And I just see this folder, and it's folder number 29 of box number 5, and it's this woman, Christine Essenberg, and she was a zoologist specializing in plankton, and nobody knows about her. And I thought, oh my goodness, this was from 1917. And she was just thrown in there. And I thought, this cannot be, this is an N of 1, but also this has to be true in archives across the nation.
Is it fun when you uncover something like that you weren't expecting to look for or to find?
It's fun, but it's infuriating. I mean, I really actually felt a little nauseated thinking that if I hadn't just stumbled on folder 29 in box 5 at UCSD, nobody would know anything about her.
And again, where can people support the organization?
lostwomenofscience.org. Thank you for asking.
We've been talking to Katie Hafner. We'll be right back after a short break. Katie, what have you learned about yourself as you work on each podcast episode?
Well, one thing, so my editor at the New York Times, this marvelous, one of the editors I had over the years, this amazing journalist named Glenn Cremon. I don't know, there was something kind of infectious about his curiosity. If you have a conversation with Glenn, he asks you you know how a lot of people love to talk about themselves? He will just ask you question after question after question. And he's always been sort of my role model for inquisitiveness. And so I saw him over the summer, and I sort of did a little bow, and I said, I want to thank you so much for the training that you gave me over the years. And he was, he wasn't consistently my editor, just sort of spottily over the years, but he just gave me this love of, figuring stuff out and always looking around the next corner. And so I found in doing the Lost Women of Science podcast that everything I have been building up to as a reporter has led to this area of deep inquiry. And while hewing to facts, we go through a really rigorous fact-checking process at Lost Women of Science. It takes us weeks to fact-check the smallest things, from the age someone was when something happened to some fundamental fact about Los Alamos, to, making sure that we have everything technically absolutely accurate. In the first season, it was the pathophysiology of cystic fibrosis, which is a very complex disease that involves a lot of different organs in the body. And in this season, it was the true evolution of the ENIAC, this one of the first modern day computers, as well as who did what, as well as what they did, as well as fission, explaining to an audience how fission works versus fusion. So there were a lot of moving pieces with this one.
I have to tell our audience that you and I spoke last week, and I was bowled over by your enthusiasm. Your eyes just lit up, and you became very, very expressive and animated when you're talking about your next book. Where did your love of storytelling come from?
My next book. Okay, I can't wait to talk about that. Maybe it was my dad who read to us unlikely stories when we were little. When my sister and I were little, he would read, for instance, Kafka, who became a lifelong love of mine. Franz Kafka. He read, my father, when I was 8 years old, read The Metamorphosis to us, which seems like odd. And then he read this one story about a ferret named Shredni Vashtar. I'll never forget that. And then he would read Alfred Hitchcock mystery stories. So he thought that no child was too young to absorb a good story. So
how did you nurture that to make the amazing career that you've had?
I don't know. I went to UCSD. That's where I studied. And I studied German literature. And I just remember walking in one day to the office of the UCSD newspaper, and my pulse quickened a little bit. I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do. I wanted to change the world, but that didn't happen. But every little bit that you do as a journalist, I think if you're a good journalist and not a kind of, bad one, right?
Totally agree.
We have such a bad rap. I'm trying to think of how to, warm people up to what we do. I mean, I feel very strongly that if you report accurately, then you can make a difference.
You're saying the media isn't always accurate or giving accurate information?
I am. Yeah.
That's a different podcast, different day, different topic.
It's just become so polarized.
Unfortunately, yes.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I know.
So one of the times where you were most animated was when you were talking about your latest book, as I mentioned, and first novel, which will be released this summer. Give us a preview of The Boys and why you're so excited about it.
Yeah, my editor really is trying to get me to refine my elevator pitch. So this is
practice with us.
So if you're in an elevator, and let's go say you're going to a high floor, so we've got a little bit of time. So The Boys is my first novel. I've written 6 books of nonfiction, so this is my first book of fiction, and this came to me thanks to my daughter. My daughter and I were on a bike trip in 2017, and something happened one night at dinner. Somebody said something that was sort of surprising, and my daughter turned to me and she said, "Mom, that's a novel. That story is a whole book." And I said, "You're right." And so knowing just that tiny little germ, that little seed of information, I wrote it. It took me a few years. You'd think that, hey, you're just making stuff up. How long could it take? It's a very different, I know, it's a very different discipline. So I actually loved making stuff up. I loved letting my imagination fly, but I keep it grounded in reality. So it's kind of I'm fusing my journalistic skill with my fiction writing skill. And the story is of a man, a lovely, endearing, slightly socially awkward man who has been living a pretty lonely existence, falls in love with a wonderful woman. They get married, and he's resistant to having kids. He then is on board with having kids, and they end up adopting these 2 kids who are Russian, and he grows, and then the pandemic comes and they're all caught inside, and he grows obsessed with the kids, and they're speaking Russian and they're watching the TV so the kids can learn English, and he's completely obsessed with the kids, and she leaves him. And then that's the first half of the book. And he's, of course, heartbroken. And the second half of the book, you get a completely different perspective on him and on the kids. And that's the story. I really wanted to write a book peopled with good people who are good to their core, because we have enough, bad actors out there in real life, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you end up writing about the topics you've written about and write about for so many top publications? Do you get to choose the topic yourself? Do they just tell you what they want? How's that work?
So I have found, I was just a guest speaker at a class at NYU, a feature writing class. And I said that I have found, and I think this is real words of wisdom, is that the stories I write best are the ones where the ideas come from me, because I am intrinsically and clearly excited about the idea. When I get assigned a story, it tends to be less exciting to me, just because I have to get my mind around it. And if I have to get my mind around the idea, then I tend to do a less impassioned job with it, because I'm not entirely convinced. Sometimes people come to me with story ideas that are just great, but usually the ideas come from me. And I write, these days, I do book reviews for the Washington Post on a regular basis. And I do obituaries and advance obituaries for the New York Times. That's my journalistic life these days, in print. And then there's the podcast.
So great segue. You've been a writer for so many years and had such great success.
So many years.
Why did you choose the podcast medium instead of the print or visual mediums to tell the story of women's contributions to science?
So as I said earlier, I think books are tough. I think it's a tough audience these days with books. I think it's hard to get people to sit still for a full biography. Also, because it's women whose lives have not been well documented, I think documenting a life enough to sustain an entire book could be tough. And I love audio. I've always loved audio. I've always loved sound. And so I could just see these things, these stories lending themselves to sound. And also people are growing much more accustomed to hearing stories in their ears. And I love music. So we have a musician, by the way, we have a composer who works for us. I mean, she has her own, we contract with her. She's actually a graduate of the Curtis Institute, the Curtis Conservatory in Philadelphia. And what I did when I was looking for a composer is I wrote to every single music conservatory I could think of in the country. And I said, we're looking for a composer for our podcast, because I wanted those who had studied composition. And I wrote to a woman. I thought, okay, smart to write to a woman about a podcast about women. And music is another area, Chris, where men, you think of male composers, right? How many female composers can you actually think of through history? So I know, don't get me started on Lost Women of Music. So this woman who actually won a Pulitzer, a composer named Jennifer Higdon at the Curtis Institute, she wrote to me and she said, I have the perfect composer for you, a young woman named Elizabeth Yunan, who lives in Australia. So it's all very virtual with her. And she writes, so you heard the music in the trailer. That's Lizzie's music. She gives us maybe 15 to 20 pieces per season to work with. And it's so much fun. I think the most fun is doing the score when we score each episode and we choose the music. 3 of us sit down, me and our producer, Sophie McNulty, and our associate producer, Ashreya Gupta. We sit there and pick the music. And it's like we sit there and think, oh my gosh, this is our job. Right?
I mentioned earlier that I admire your enthusiasm for the subjects you research and write about. How can the rest of us ignite more intense curiosity in ourselves? And how would it improve our lives and relationships if we did?
Oh gosh, I love that question. It's like, look around. I mean, as I said earlier, we tend to love to talk about ourselves, and I'm no exception, but I always make sure I ask, like, the next person you meet, get their story. Everybody has a story, and it's fun. It's like because you learn not just about their story, but let's say they're from Nebraska, you learn something about Nebraska, something about the rest of the country. I think that's absolutely key to a fulfilling life, is opening your eyes to the world around you and letting it in.
And that's a great point, great way to look. But, as we're coming out of the pandemic, people are now just sort of getting re-engaged with society.
I know. It's tough. I understand. It's very tough. I mean, I have my main character in the novel goes to the grocery store and has an absolute panic attack during, because someone's breathing all over the bok choy without a mask on, and he freaks out. And he abandons his grocery cart and leaves and goes home, and his wife says, "Where are the groceries?" And he says, "I just couldn't do it." And I get that. However, baby steps.
Exactly. Exactly. I coach my son's, or help coach my son's Little League baseball team, and we have had practice over the weekend. And I'm tossing some balls, and one of the dads who was helping me coach came over and was giving me some of the balls he's picking up in the field, but he would drop them into my hand as opposed to sort of like place them and accidentally touch, which is what we did 2 years ago. So like you said, very slowly we'll get re-engaged. We'll figure out what the new norm is, hopefully, but we'll figure it out together.
I know I met someone the other day, and she put out her hand to shake my hand, and I thought, okay, I can do that.
It, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it felt different. Actually, I could feel like her hand
felt better.
The grip was strong, and the hand was warm, and there's something about that tactile experience.
We need it. That's what we need. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to your book writing. Your sixth book, published in 2013, was titled Mother, Daughter, Me. The headline of the book review in the New York Times was Mother, Daughter, Me, a feel-good experiment that wasn't, piqued my curiosity. Share with our audience the story of Mother, Daughter, Me. And was it really a feel-good experiment that didn't feel so good after all?
Well, that's an odd headline, isn't it? A feel-good experiment that wasn't. Are they saying that the experiment wasn't, or that it wasn't feel-good? So actually, so I didn't grow up with my mother. My sister and I were taken away from her when I was 10 and my sister was 12. We'd been living in San Diego, but I had stayed close to her, and just not raised by her. And so when she went through a tough time in 2009, she was going through a tough time. I brought her up to San Francisco to live with my daughter and me. My daughter and I were still kind of reeling from my husband having died very young, and he had died at age 45 and of a sudden heart attack, and my daughter was 8, and we'd been through just a horrible time since then. And so we kind of had a no drama policy. And little did I know that bringing my mother to live with my daughter and me would sort of reignite kind of a bunch of badness for me. And then none of us behaved very well. We all kind of acted out. My daughter didn't like not being the center of attention. My mother was going through this rough time. And I didn't know my mother as well as I thought I did, and she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. And 3 generations living together is tough, no matter, it has to be pretty perfect circumstances. So it kind of blew up. And I wrote about it. I wrote about the whole year of trying to live together, but flashbacks to my really horrific childhood. I mean, it was a bad one. So So yeah, unfortunately, it was a mess. But we're all here, and my daughter's about to get her MD, and she's a superstar, and that's that. I mean, it's, life, as you say, this whole question of resilience. And my sister, who was born less resilient than I was, and I do not know how that happened, how biology sorts itself that way. But I don't know if you have siblings and you would say your brother or your sister is able to pick up the pieces more easily than you are, or vice versa.
I'm the only child from divorced parents, so I'm another podcast episode to talk about.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So so that, I'm now shying away from memoir. I'm not about to write another one anytime soon.
So that being said, let's talk about your other podcast, Our Mothers Ourselves.
Oh, yeah. So that is actually a lovely story. So when the pandemic first hit and we were all quite despairing, and it felt like the world was coming to an end, I decided to do something uplifting. And I'd always wanted to try my hand at podcasting. So I said to my husband, I came home, I said, I'm going to do a podcast about great moms. And he said, oh, no, really? Okay. So I decided to do it on my 10th grade geometry teacher from Amherst, Massachusetts, and Mrs. Fitzpatrick. And I found Mrs. Fitzpatrick's daughter, interviewed Ellen Fitzpatrick. I had no idea, Chris. I had no idea what I was doing. I knew nothing about, like, what microphone do I use? I knew nothing. I thought, how hard could GarageBand be? I mean, how hard could it be? So
Fake it till you make it.
The thing took me 30 minutes of audio, took me probably 7 full days of 18-hour days to put together, which should have taken, 50 minutes. And I was like taking like little teeny tiny electronic scissors and like piecing it all together, and then I'd lose it, and my husband heard me up here like tapping away, and he'd hear it, and then I finished it and I sent it to him, and I thought, and I felt like I was like a first grader going to their parent and saying, look what I made. And I hear him downstairs listening to this god awful thing. And he, and of course I stole music, and I actually held my phone up with the music to the microphone. I had no idea how to put the music. It was a mess.
So GarageBand isn't that simple.
Well, now I'm like, it's no problem, but it's a learning curve. And he was listening to it, and I heard him down there, and I'm thinking, uh-oh, crikey, he hates it. And he just texted me from downstairs, and he goes, wow. So
it worked out.
I know. So then I just started. I love it. I love that podcast. I've been stepping back from it a tiny bit because of Lost Women of Science is so time consuming, but we celebrate extraordinary mothers. So again, if you have an extraordinary mother, like I featured Julie Andrews, who was a great mom who had a terrible childhood. I don't know if you know much about her, her life.
Yeah.
And I love golf, the game of golf. So I interviewed Amy Alcott, who was a great golfer back in the day, about her mom. So very fun.
We have just a few minutes left in conversation that I've been completely fascinated by and had a lot of fun with. Where can people find more information about you, your books, your podcasts, and more?
Oh, that's so nice. So katiehafner.com. So my first name and my last name. And then lostwomenofscience.org, of course. And so if you go to katiehafner.com, you can see all my New York Times work, which is a lot of obituaries these days, sadly. And then the Washington Post book reviews that I write. and that's all up there. Unfortunately, I'm really easy to find. Yeah.
Katie Hafner has been our guest today. Katie, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was just great.
It's been a lot of fun. And as always, thank you to our marvelous listeners and viewers for tuning in to Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details about upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek public figure and on Twitter at @ChrisMeek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, public policy, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.